Good afternoon, everyone. Please keep eating. My name is Lee Posey, and on behalf of the New America Foundation, a public policy think tank based in Washington and here in Sacramento, I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to our discussion of Barry Lynn's Cornered, the New Monopoly Capitalism and the Economics of Destruction. In the early 20th century, a tremendous debate over the role of big business and the corporation took place. It was a time when the essential strangeness of the corporation, a creature of the state, mostly treated as an individual under the law, was front and center. It was also a time of enormous consolidation and monopoly, a moment when, as the economic historian Robert Heilbronner has pointed out, by 1904, one or two giant firms controlled at least half the output in some 78 major American industries. This progressive era debate was joined from many angles, but in three major ways. Those who were simply foes of bigness and consolidation altogether, represented among some strands of populism. Those, like most progressives, who tried to wrestle with the question of economic benefit versus social cost, and put their faith in better regulation. As President Teddy Roosevelt once put it, a few men recognized that corporations and combinations had become indispensable in the business world, that it was folly to prohibit them, but it was also folly to leave them without thoroughgoing control. And the third angle of this debate, as it were, was represented by those who were then called industrialists, and who were, with substantial support from the state, setting in motion what we now think of as the modern American economy. The Carnegies and Rockefellers and Fords, and especially those who worked for them, said relatively little, but were putting into place facts on the ground, as it were. In the end, both bigness and regulation, I'd argue, prevailed. In the intervening century, some companies were broken up and some grew larger, despite a tremendous array of social regulation, especially related to the environment. But what tended to vanish over the years, despite its centrality, was the corporation itself. Bigness not only in manufacturing, but also in communication, in retail, and in other sectors has become taken for granted as a normal part of modern life. That's starting to change. And in the work of my friend and colleague, New America colleague Barry Lynn, both the visibility of the modern corporation, along with a strong critique of their power, has been thoroughly revived. His new book, Cornered, is a timely and sobering account of how economic power has been reconcentrated and combined in most sectors of modern life, what that means for us, and what we might try to do about it. And I was struck when reading this book, as I hope many of you will have the chance to do after you purchase it here at the front, about some of the arguments he makes, the fact that as we become more concentrated, we actually become less resilient and have less redundancy in many of the important sectors of our life, including manufacturing. As most of you have seen from his bio, Barry has written for just about every business journal and magazine in the country and around the world, and has appeared frequently on radio and television to make his case. He's consulted with high-level officials as well around the world, in Japan, Germany, Britain, France, the EC, in the White House, and in the U.S. Treasury Department. Although he does seem personally too mild-mannered to be a revolutionary, his article his argument is as radical and as important as those made by the muckrakers and the progressives more than a century ago. We're very fortunate to have him here today in Sacramento, and please join me in welcoming Barry Lynn.
Well, thank you, Lee. That was a very useful introduction. I mean, it's actually some of my points about corporations, and I don't have to make them now. But I am really happy you all came out today. And what I'd like to start doing today is to start talking a little bit about tea parties, because there's lots of loose talk about tea parties in this country right now. And it's very important to get the story of the original Tea Party right, because there's all these different interpretations. And some people say that the original Tea Party was a protest against high taxes or high prices, and that's actually not really the case, because the Tea Act of 1773 actually resulted in tea that was a lot less expensive than the prevailing market. And it's not really accurate to say that the Tea Party, the original Tea Party, was a protest against taxation without representation. And that's an important issue, but for a long time beforehand, there'd been a rumor afoot that the tax had been canceled, and yet all these people in Boston and around the other colonies continued to organize, continued to get ready for protest. So the real story is that the Tea Partiers, the original Tea Partiers, they rose against monopoly. Folks in America back then didn't want any one company governing our trade in tea or anything else for that matter, even when it resulted in lower prices. What they wanted was liberty to trade, liberty to make open markets in which to interact with each other. The original Tea Parties, the founders, they accepted taxation taxation within reason, but what they rejected was monopolization of commerce. They rejected that completely. America, as we all know, was born in many rebellions against monopoly. Monopolization over our souls by any one church, monopolization over our land by any few feudal lords, monopolization over our commerce and our markets by any few companies of men. For 200 years, with more or less success, as we've noted, we used our anti-monopoly laws to protect ourselves against such forms of control. Anti-monopoly laws are single most important, most fundamental tool for extending the concept of checks and balances into the political economy. It's our single most important tool for protecting ourselves from concentration of economic and hence political power. It's our single most important tool for preventing the erection of private government, because as Leith just made clear, that's what corporations are. They're private government. They exist, they're part of government, but they run privately. If there's any one thing that's unfortunate about anti-monopoly laws, is that fact that it kind of sounds like we're against something, because at the heart of our anti-monopoly laws is this vision. It's like a very positive, powerful, elegant vision, which is that we're going to be a people, an independent republic made up of independent citizens. And it's important that we understand what these two things mean. When the independent republic, when the founders, when they spoke about free trade, they didn't mean no rules. They didn't mean that you can do whatever you wanted. What they meant was that our nation would not be dependent on any foreign power. We were not going to have any foreign power governing our commerce, our industry, our markets in this country. When they spoke about an independent republic, their intent was that we were going to use our government. We're going to use government to protect ourselves against foreign monopolists, against foreign mercantilists. And independent citizen, the basic idea there is that to have a true democracy, we can't have large groups of our fellows dependent on a powerful few. The idea is that every citizen has to, or at least as many citizens as possible, should have property. The property is like, could also be your labor. It's a way of making money. And you need to have the liberty to work that property. Liberty to work, that meant you had to make open marketplaces. And if you want open marketplaces, that demanded that we use our government to carefully restrict the use of corporations by those who would rule some activity or other, to prevent any would-be lord from using these institutions to concentrate power. That's why the goal of the founders was to distribute property and power as widely as possible, to enable as many citizens as possible to make themselves as independent as possible. Over the years, a lot of folks have said that Jefferson and Madison were naive. They said this vision of distributing power as widely as possible, that it would hinder specialization of labor, that it would hinder the creation of greater piles of material wealth. They said that their vision was not essentially efficient. You know, in truth, Madison and Jefferson's vision was extremely sophisticated politically. You know, they understood that many of those who preach extreme specialization of labor, like their colleague, Mr. Hamilton, they actually favored using monopolies, these private governments with sanction of the public government, to concentrate wealth, to concentrate power, to concentrate control in the hands of the people using them and of their friends. You know, what Madison and Jefferson and the other Democratic Republicans, what they actually believed, their sense was that if we create enough independent citizens, that these independent farmers, these independent shopkeepers, these independent artisans, these independent producers, or in modern, the way we talk about it nowadays, these entrepreneurs, these small businessmen and women, these innovators, these people would, in turn, they would serve as the bulwark of liberty. That's actually a word that Madison used, that they would serve as the bulwark to protect the system against the lords. The Madison sort of expressed this idea in a really simple equation. He said, this is a quote, "The greater the proportion of this class to the whole society, the more free, the more independent, and the more happy must be society itself." And so the founders, or at least that faction that came to be called, or called themselves Democratic Republicans, as opposed to aristocratic Republicans, they established government in the United States and America not to empower the few to rule the many, but they established government precisely to empower the many to work together, to protect ourselves against the powerful few. We established government to keep ourselves free. So anyway, I think it's worth taking a little look at our independent republic of independent citizens today, 29 years after President Reagan freed the domestic monopolists to do what they will in our political economy, 16 years after President Clinton freed the foreign mercantilists to do what they will in our political economy. And, you know, one of the ways to do this is actually look at just a few of the activities in which we engage as a people. And I actually like to start with books. Some of you may recollect that last fall, just before Christmas, there was a pricing war between Walmart and Amazon. And they were just kind of throwing books out below invoice, or taking books that they were paying the publishers $14 for, and they were throwing them out the door at $9.99. Now, for the consumers at the time, this seemed like this, you know, fantastic event. All these cheap books. But the thing is that these are two giant corporations, two giant conglomerates that are in a war to see who controls the internet, sell stuff over the internet. And what they didn't care about books. What they were trying to do, they don't care about the consumers, they were just trying to get people into their doors to buy other things, to buy TVs and t-shirts. Now because of this, I write a lot about how when you have this concentration of power over a single marketplace, with the people that have that power often exercise that power in ways that harm the producers. In this case, it's the people who edit our books, the people who write our books. So I want to talk to a bunch of publishers in New York. And these are pretty big, swaggering guys. Their offices are way up in these towers in New York. And you know what? When you go into their rooms and you close the door, they would tell you stories about Amazon and just curl your hair. They hate Amazon. They are afraid of Amazon. Amazon now controls more than half. My book, more than half of my sales are through Amazon. That's true pretty much of any political book in this country. E-books in this country. More than 80% of e-books go across Amazon. And then at the low level, it's Walmart. Walmart controls the low-level books. People are afraid, that publishers in this country are afraid of these two corporations. They'll tell you that in the back room. When they step outside in the public life, they say, they're my best customer. I don't know, I doubt that many of the folks here in this room would think that it's a good sign. It's good to have the publishers of our books in a republic, in a democratic republic, living in fear of one or two companies. Beer, we're actually, right now I guess I'm not sure how this connects, but we're kind of in a small brewery. Beer in this country seems like one of the great victories that we've seen for small production. 1978, there were 42 breweries in the United States. Now there are some 1,630 breweries. The difference, though, is that in 1978, the largest brewery, Anheuser-Busch, had about 25% of the market. Now the two largest breweries, Anheuser-Busch InBev and South African Breweries, which is Miller Coors, they control well above 90% of the market. 1,625 of our breweries, including these fellows at the corner, they share 4% of the marketplace. That's what they're allowed. I spoke recently at this conference of those 1,625 independents. And at one point I snuck into a room where they're having a big powwow just among themselves. And at one point, pretty early on, this guy stood up in his little Carhartt jacket and he said, he goes, there's just something wrong in this country. We have two foreign corporations that are determining how we brew beer. Who gets to win, who gets to lose in this market? I have to sell my beer. When I want to get my beer on the someone's shelf, I got to call up Anheuser-Busch. Will you carry my beer on your truck? Will you put my beer on your shelf? This is just wrong, this man said. And then up on the dais, one of the, there's the muckamucks, the big guys in the small beer, craft beer brewing industry. And one of them, just said, hey, let's just stop talking about that right now, because there's really nothing we can do about it. And if we talk about it, well, those people won't abide that kind of criticism. 1,625 brewers in America, they live in fear. They can be turned off. Their access to the market can be turned off tomorrow. America's farmers. Here's actually a case in which the Obama administration is actually going out and talking about the concentration of power. They've been doing it. They have all these hearings recently, looking in the poultry industry, the dairy industry, seeds, beef cattle. And what they keep finding time after time, perfect monopolies. If you grow chickens in America today, there is no open market. You kind of either grow it for Tyson's or Purdue. And you can't take, if you're growing for Tyson's, you can't take that chicken that's out and sell it to you at Purdue. You're stuck in your little space. They give you the chicks, they give you the feed, they give you the drugs, and they give it at the price that they fix. And then when you sell them back to the chickens, you take the price that they fix. You don't even get to go into the back room where they weigh your chickens. With the weight that they give you, it may not accord with the weight that you saw back in your farm. But if you question that weight, you're in a lot of trouble. There's a good chance they're not going to take your next shipment of chicken. There was a hearing in Alabama. They had Eric Holder was there, the Attorney General. Christine Varney, the head of the Antitrust Division. Tom Vilsack, the head of the Department of Agriculture. They're all in this room, and they had these little chicken farmers out there. None of them would speak against the big people in public. None of them. Because they could be crushed. It's the same in milk. It's increasingly the same in beef cattle. But it's not just people who are small businesses and farmers in this country. It's also increasingly workers, independent workers, salaried workers, white-collar employees, Ivy League educated professionals are seeing this power concentrated over them. Madison Avenue, you've probably all seen that show, Mad Men, which is back in the old days, it's the way it used to be. All of these different agencies, all this competition, all this movement, all this freedom. Used to be more than 20 big agencies on Madison Avenue. Well, last 10 years, they've all been brought under the umbrella of 3 holding companies. You know, if you work for these, and I know a lot of folks, Ivy League educated folks work on Madison Avenue. You know, if you want to change jobs, it's a lot harder than it was 10 years ago. If you want to ask for more pay, it's a lot harder than it was 10 years ago. If you want to stand up to your boss, you probably don't want to do that. It's true in Silicon Valley. Another DOJ investigation. They do a lot of investigations, they just don't take action. Another DOJ investigation, they were looking over these companies down in Silicon Valley, Google, IBM, Apple, Intel. They're pretty powerful, right? You'd think they could pay market rates for their labor. No, I don't like that. They found that these guys created a buyer's cartel. They will, so that they don't go and hire people from each other. Wall Street Journal said they have agreed not to recruit each other's employees. You know, we have a fancy term for this. It's called labor monotony. But there's actually a simpler way to understand what's going on. And it's when we let them make monopolies, we cede to them the power to govern us. We cede to them the power to dictate terms to us. We cede to them the power to force us to bend our knees. You know, in our independent republic, you know, as many of you will recollect, it took 20 years of vicious political battle in early America. The Sedition Act, the Embargo Act of 1807, the War 1812, to free ourselves from the British trade system. You know, this was the other front in the battle between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians. You know, because just as Hamilton and his buddies, they wanted to herd the American people into industrial estates, they also wanted to accept dependence on British manufacturers, or rather they wanted us to be dependent on the domestic traders and bankers who were allied with the British manufacturers. But the Democratic Republicans resisted. They insisted on this thing called reciprocal trade. They insisted on free trade, which meant no dependence on any one country. And we actually eventually succeeded in doing that. We broke free from the British trade system. And we kept ourselves free for 150 years. And after World War II, we enjoyed the power to impose onto the international system, remake the international system in our own Republican image, small r Republican. You know, this marvelous web of interdependence that Tom Friedman talks about so eloquently, you know, this didn't just happen the way Tom Friedman likes to say. It's not like the result of some metaphysical force called globalization. God didn't decree this web of interdependence. No, it was actually American governments, American statesmen. It was people in Washington, 1944, 45, into the 50s and the 60s. They built that system. They enforced that system. They extended it first in Europe. EU is an American creation. Extended across the sea to Japan, and then they extended it around the world. You know, not all the results were perfect, but, you know, we should give those people the credit they deserve. 65 years of peace, 65 years of prosperity around the world, 65 years of integration. For a long period, not quite 65 years, they actually managed to keep the American people free. Even though there was integration, there was still independence. We were not dependent on any other country. Over the last 16 years, what have our modern free traders done, especially under Bill Clinton? They have sold the keys to this empire, this liberal, cosmopolitan, enlightened empire that was built so carefully on the bones of 100 million people killed. They turned the control over this intricate political system. They turned that control over to Wall Street. They turned it over to Wall Street's great trading companies, the British East India companies of today, companies like Walmart. We outsourced to them the power to govern the system. You know the result? America and Americans today have once again been made to depend on foreign powers. You know, you probably know that we don't make a whole lot of semiconductors or light bulbs or batteries anymore. Every day fewer. But you know, chemical ingredients, the chemical ingredients that go in our drugs, more than 90% of the chemicals that go in our drugs come from China. 90% more. Food ingredients, vitamin C. Vitamin C, which is also known as ascorbic acid, which goes into all preserved foods, not all, almost all preserved foods on the stores, or the shelves of our stores. Vitamin C was a material that was first identified by an American scientist. It was first synthesized by an American scientist. It was first mass-produced by an American company. 100% of the vitamin C that we consume, the ascorbic acid that goes into our packaged foods, 100% comes from China. You know, we talk endlessly in this country about energy independence, even though no one country delivers us more than like 12% of our oil. Imagine what would happen if China decided just to close parts of its border. Imagine what kind of disruptions would happen here. I doubt we would go to war with them. You tend not to go to war with your suppliers. We would cave. We would do what they want us to do. You know what the Obama administration feels when they look at China? They feel fear. You know, that's just the beginning. You know, this book, you know, today's monopolies are bad in so many different ways. You know, real variety. If you go to buy eyeglasses, you go to buy toothpaste, you go to buy pet food, every one of these areas, one company dominates more than half. We see lots of different variety, apparent variety in the stores, but it's increasingly an illusion of choice. It's not a real choice. It's a manipulated choice. Quality of our products is going down. Safety of our products and systems in many cases going down. Health, you know, if we look at it in terms of, you know, measured by things like diabetes, life expectancy in certain segments of the population, down. Prices, we always talk about how prices, we've got the lowest price in the world. It just ain't true. It's not true. Vitamin C, for instance, you know what happened when the Chinese vitamin cartel ended up completing its capture control? Next day they raised prices 400%. Beer. Last year was a very bad year for drinking beer in this country. Great recession. Last year also we saw input prices down. Energy was way down from 2008. Grain prices way down from 2008. You know what happened to the price of beer on August 2009? Went up. That's what you do when you got 90% of the marketplace. Job creation in this country, down. Innovation in this country, down. The stability of our most vital systems, our financial systems, our production systems. You've all heard the word too big to fail, too integrated to fail. That's actually what I do in my day job. That's all way down, that stability. Destructive speculation, up. Manipulation of choice in our political system, up. Autocratic control, up. You know, pretty much every market in America right now is monopolized. Microsoft, Intel, IBM, Cisco, Apple, these are little clusters of monopolies. And I haven't even mentioned, you know, the people that got their hands on our brains, you know, AT&T, Comcast, Google. You know, one way to understand just how bad it is in our land, cowboy capitalism, is to look at cowboy boots. Three biggest brands are called Justin, Tony Lama, and Nokona. You know who owns all three? It's a fellow named who lives in Omaha. It's Mr. Warren Buffett owns all three. Cowboy capitalism in the year of our Lord 2010, it means that the capitalist gets to charge the cowboy rent to stand in his own boots. Yeah, so how did this happen? You know, the simplest answer is that we allowed ourselves to be taught to see ourselves differently. You know, in 1776, Jefferson, when he was sketching out the original version of the Declaration of Independence, and people actually, they went and they looked at his original copy, and they x-rayed it recently, and they found this. This is just in the paper this year. First he wrote in the word subject, and then he scratched it out, and then he wrote over that word citizen. You know, this is hugely important because subjects view themselves as being under the state, or rather under the people who control the state. You know, you may have rights that you could go and beg that will be enforced, but you're not of the state. Citizens, by contrast, are the state. The citizens write the rules. That's our right. For 200 years in this country, we saw ourselves, thanks to Mr. Jefferson, as citizens. And as citizens, what did we do? What do we value foremost? We valued liberty foremost. Then about a generation ago, we allowed ourselves to be relabeled consumers. I mean, I could go on all day about who did that and how. But what do consumers value? Not liberty. Consumers value stuff. They like lots of stuff, cheap stuff. You know, and it's important to emphasize, I'm not making some kind of a hippie rant here against materialism. What I'm talking about is actually law, real world law. Because strange as this may seem, this idea that Americans are consumers rather than citizens was actually used to reframe how we enforce our anti-monopoly laws. For 2 centuries, as we've seen, we used anti-monopoly law to protect citizens from concentrated power, to protect ourselves from predation by people wielding corporations. You know, the goals were simple. We were going to distribute power. We were going to protect liberty. We were going to protect property. The means and principles were simple. Competition for the sake of competition. Protection of open markets. And then in 1981, the Reagan administration, as soon as they took power, they changed the frame. They said they were going to adopt something called consumer welfare as measured by price. Now, this may seem innocuous enough, you know, the idea that you're going to help out consumers. But in practice, the consumer welfare frame is but a thin disguise for the old efficiency argument. Now, as some of you remember, the old-timey monopolists, like Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. J.P. Morgan, they always use that word efficiency to justify their accumulation of power, of arbitrary power. The competition, they used to say, is wasteful. Concentration, control in their own hands, that's efficient. It's the same argument that Louis XIV made. It was the same argument that the Marxists made. It's the same argument the Leninists made. It's the same argument the Stalinists made. It's the same argument that many of the people who run our biggest corporations think Walmart make today. Let's be very clear how this logic of consumerism plays out in our political economy over time. If consumers are served best by lower prices, and if lower prices are achieved through economies of scale, ergo, monopoly is our best friend. You know, and right now, the Supreme Court says that repeatedly. Monopoly is our best friend because it's helping out the consumer. To accept consumerism is to accept the efficiency argument. To accept the efficiency argument has always been, be it in 18th century France, 19th century plutocratic America, 20th century Soviet Union, to board mainline highball express to concentration. Not merely an economic power, but a political power. It's a straight line to autocratic government. You know, and in the 3 decades since Reagan overthrew anti-monopoly law, in our America, in market after market, a few folks have used these immense corporations, these immense trading companies, flying the banner of efficiency. They've busted into our communities. They've inserted themselves in between producer and buyer. They've inserted themselves in between neighbor and neighbor. They have used these private governments to seize our properties, to establish private taxation systems, because that's what monopoly rents are. It's private tax. They have erected themselves as rulers over almost all economic activity in this country. They have the power to determine who does what, where, and how much we get. They have erected themselves as rulers over our states, our communities, increasingly over our very selves. So when you hear next the word consumer, you might want to swap in the word tenant. You might want to swap in the word proletarian, peon, who once every 4 years is patronized by one or the other factions of the elite, the red faction, the blue faction. When you hear the word consumer, you might want to think concentration of power sufficient to rule you and your children and your community for a generation and perhaps forever. You know, we must be honest with ourselves about what has taken place in America today. All this monopolization, all these bailouts of the rich and powerful, this ain't socialism, like the Tea Party folks say. It's not a takeover of the private sector by the state. It is a takeover of the state by a few private rulers. It is the use of the state to further empower those few private rulers. We see in America today a combination of public and private power is increasingly feudal in nature, increasingly arbitrary in nature, increasingly autocratic in nature, increasingly allied with foreign autocratic states. You know, what is at stake today in America is our democracy. It's our free society. It's our most basic liberties. What is at stake is our republic. So what do we do? We've only got about 2 minutes, right? It kind of seems a little hopeless, doesn't it? You know, well, it's not going to be easy. But I am completely and absolutely 1,000% certain that we are going to whoop these mothers. We're going to break up these Goliaths or harness them. We're going to redistribute that power. We are going to refound in America once again a democratic republic. Why am I so optimistic? Well, first off, and this is extremely important, we've been here before. And we beat these powers before. 1981 was not the first time a republic in America was overthrown. It happened also after the Civil War. You know, we use a strange term, plutocrat, to describe the powerful of that era. It's probably more useful if we view men like Rockefeller and Carnegie as a second generation of feudal lords. They didn't have plantations, but what they had is industrial estates. Rather than look at someone like J.P. Morgan simply as a powerful banker, it might be a little more useful to look at him as a sort of king. You know, when he concentrated his power over Wall Street, he took unto himself the power to, among these lords, determine which of them should thrive and which of them would not. He basically could create property and destroy it at will. You know, some of you may have heard Glenn Beck ranting recently about how the classical progressives were socialists and corporatists. And, you know, Leif was kind of hinting at this before. You know, you may have heard Mr. Beck talk about Teddy Roosevelt as a socialist. You know, I don't spend a lot of my time agreeing with Glenn Beck, but, you know, there's actually a lot of truth to what he's saying in this case. You know, Teddy Roosevelt did not bust up trust, even though we talk about him as a trust buster. He was not a trust buster. He was a trust taker. When he took on Morgan in 1902 with the Northern Securities case, his goal was not to destroy the power that Morgan had concentrated. It was to take that power in his own hands. What he wanted was to take the crown off of Mr. Morgan's head and put it on his own head. You know, and it didn't really work that way. In 1907, with the big crash of 1907, then again in 1912 when they started to hold hearings. They found out that Mr. Morgan was just as powerful as ever. All that happened for the next 30 years was we didn't know who was running what. It was a big corporatist mess. Now this history may seem kind of ancient, kind of antique, kind of not very applicable to our reality today, but I rehearse it because it illuminates a really important fact. The reason that we get to blame Reagan and Clinton for overthrowing a democratic republic in the 1980s and 1990s is because the American people in the 1930s restored a democratic republic in our land. They restored a republic of independent citizens. We did so during this thing called the Second New Deal. Libertarians today, they like to remind us, and rightly so, they say that the American people are rejecting the centralization of the First New Deal, that we rejected centralized planning in America. That we did. And that we rejected government control of the political economy. That we did. But what these same libertarians don't tend to like to recollect, and this is because the Libertarian Party, at least the high libertarians, are the vanguard of today's feudalism, is that the American people during the Second New Deal also rejected privately directed centralization. We rejected private planning like goes on in Bentonville. We rejected private socialization of risk like what goes on in Wall Street. We rejected private corporate rule. And this is really important because even as Germany and Japan and Italy and Russia were falling ever deeper into authoritarian horror, our great-grandparents, inspired by Madison, inspired by Jefferson, inspired by that James Madison in the 20th century, a fellow named Louis Brandeis, Justice Brandeis, we went the exact opposite direction. We set out to force industrial oligopolies to compete. We set out to democratize access to capital. We set out to remake open markets and then protect them from enclosure. We set out to protect the independent storekeeper and protect the individual farmer and individual innovator from men wielding great chains and giant corporations. We set out to break up all of that power, to restore a system of checks and balances in the political economy, and we did so in the Second New Deal beginning in 1935. We beat down those Goliaths, we took that power, and we returned it to the individual, independent citizen in the local community. So if ever we are to reestablish this democratic republic in America and make it fit for a 21st century, we must recognize the Second New Deal for what it really was, which is a second American Revolution that restored power over the political economy of the country to we the people. Very quickly, there's 4 other reasons that I'm going to mention here. There's others, but there's 4 other ones I'm going to mention here about why we shall prevail. First off, again, this issue about too big to fail, too integrated to fail. We have no option. I'm not going to talk about this. This is my day job, and I'm not going to talk about it much here, but the fact is that these systems are not stable. They're built to crash. We have no option but to fix them, because the kind of crashes that we could have nowadays would be truly cataclysmic. This is actually an argument that you can walk into. This is what I do. You can walk into any group, any meeting in Washington or Brussels and talk to a bunch of economists, a bunch of industrialists. This argument pretty much shatters their arguments. It shatters their smug security. It's a very powerful argument that these systems, the way they've exercised their power, they've made these systems fantastically unstable. No option but to fix them. The second reason we shall prevail is because we have the power. Right now, all these different people, the beer brewers over here, the opticians, the book publishers, the software engineers, the scientists, the assembly line workers in this country, ad agency workers, the community bankers in this country, everyone is fighting the powers all by themselves. They're all off in their own little corners cowering. when we come together, and we shall come together, we're starting to come together, we will see that we all are facing and fighting the same power. When we come together, we're going to see that there is a whole hell of a lot more of us than there are of them. Third reason, a whole lot of them are actually going to help us out. You know, the rich, they're not some kind of monolithic community. They're not like a monolithic class. You know, there's no political people running around holding guns up to their heads. A whole bunch of them actually believe in the American dream, the American Republic, and the American Democratic Republic that once existed. In fact, that's how a lot of them got rich, because of the opportunities that were put into place, given to them in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s. Sam Walton got rich because of antitrust. If it weren't for antitrust, we'd all be shopping at the A&P and Woolworths. Sam Walton, Walmart exists because of antitrust enforcement. A whole lot of those people are going to come, and they actually already are starting to come around, and we're going to work with us because the stakes are too high. Last reason I mentioned today is we have a duty. You know, we cannot, we shall not be the generation that allows this chain to break after 250 years, after 800 years, going back to the Magna Carta, after, you know, we could take this chain back to some ways to Athens and Jerusalem. Where our children, where our grandparents and our great-great-great-grandparents, they stood, where they fought and where they won freedom for us. I don't think we're just going to sit in fear and fail. I don't think we're going to deliver to our children to a future of cockfight tournaments in which they're set up competing with each other for the benefit of someone else. I don't think we're going to deliver them to a future of unrestrained bossism in which only the craven and corrupt thrive. You know, we who inherited a democratic republic have a duty to bequeath the democratic republic to the next generation, and we shall. You know, it's already starting, and strangely enough, I end up working a lot with folks in the Tory party. There's some pretty radical thinking going on in the Tory party and the Liberal Democratic Party. Lots of fights going on there. We'll see who prevails, but some very interesting new thinking. It's happening here on the streets of America. That's what the Tea Party is, or was, before they allowed Mr. Murdoch-Sconey to give them leadership. But those people, we're going to get them back. A lot of those people, that's what they stood up for. The people, when the Tea Partiers first took to the streets, what were they upset about? They were upset about bailout of the banks. Upset about bailout of Detroit and the investors, the bond holders. We're going to get them back. They're going to come to us. I talk to Tea Party folks all the time. There was a pretty big difference between the people you see on TV and the people who are actually in the street. We've seen it actually, strangely enough, with financial reform to some extent, the derivatives part of this bill. The people in the United States actually controlled Congress. We made Congress do our will. We got a pretty good derivatives section of this bill against the wishes of the Obama administration. We forced them to swallow these changes. You know, we see it right here in this room. People come out every day and say, hey, we're going to just do something different. You know, right now, the American people, we're just now awakening from this long, strange, pathetic, opium dream of free marketism, of consumerism. You know, and when we look at our hands, it's going to be easy. We're just going to look at our hands, we're going to see that we can actually make things with our own hands, and that's what we're going to do. And you know what? It's going to be a lot of fun when we do it. Anyway, thanks for coming out.
Well, if there are no questions after that, I really mistake my audience, our audience. But please just go ahead. I have some things to say too, but I'd like to throw it open to you first. And if you do go on your way out, please pick up a book from our independent bookseller, Avid Reader, on the way out the door. Questions over here?
Wait for that.
The question was about too big to fail, and especially in the financial system, and whether the Federal Reserve actually has the powers and has the plan to make the system, keep the system from collapsing. You know, I actually think that they largely went in the wrong direction. You know, they tended to make things bigger. Just when the crisis happened, they allowed all these mergers to take place within banking, and they're not reversing that. There's been a lot of talk about reversing it. Simon Johnson and a few other folks are really pushing this idea, but they're not doing it yet. You know, regulators, when they get more power in their own hands, people tend to trust themselves. So regulators tend not to let go of that power. So I think that we've made a really big error in terms of the way we've pursued this. And we really need to be talking about how to make these banks smaller, recreate. You know, it's not a matter of just having higher reserve levels. It's a matter of creating compartments so that you don't have contagion. And the way you create compartments is you make things smaller.
Here.
Wait for the microphone.
What kind of role do you see education, both K-12 and higher education, play in this, and how do you see that? I think we see some of the trends that you're talking about there, and the second question is where do we fit in? Because it seems to me these are the two vehicles by which change might be promoted.
Well, education, I mean, I'm actually wary to step into that. You know, I'm from D.C. and I live in D.C. and we just voted out Mayor Fenty because he had Ms. Rhee as his head of education. You know, how do we blow up the union operation? Education. If you're not, maybe you're talking about educating people.
Yes.
Okay.
Process.
Yeah. No, because educating people and media, that actually. That's the key. It's a matter of how do we reconnect people, Americans, with their own history? How do we reconnect people with Americans with the old-timey language, which is of political economics, as opposed to this modern language of just plain economics. You guys may remember, it's kind of like what, you can also the movie Wizard of Oz. And Wizard of Oz was written in 1896. It was written or 97. It was just after the Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan. And we were having these discussions about who would run the money system in the United States. Would it be a few Wall Street bankers or would it be the people? And there's that scene in the Wizard of Oz, which came out, it was written in the populist era. And remember, there's different. This is a tangent. There's different forms of populism. The real populism is democratic republicanism, it is Jeffersonianism. The Populist Party was a Jeffersonian party. Nowadays, we apply this word populist to all these dangerous demagogues. Populism, properly understood, is Jeffersonian, Madisonian, democratic republicanism. But anyway, that book, came out in 1896 during a populist era. The movie came out in another populist era in 1939. There's that scene at the end. They pull back the curtain and there's a bunch of levers. There's no magic. And there's a little man in there running these levers. That's what we have to do in this country today. That's the education. And it's like, there is no metaphysical forces out there like Tom Friedman says. That globalization is not some, thing that, it's not like some God without a mind out there that's just taking us in a certain direction. Everything is political. Everything is being run by somebody someplace. So that reconnecting people, we've done it in the past. We've done it through allegory. We've done it through all these different ways. We're going to do it again. The problem, of course, is the media concentration. I mean, net neutrality is a pretty big issue. It's bad enough when you turn on TV and you got Fox, you got Mr. Murdoch-Sconian, running the whole party. just like in Italy. It'll get a lot worse if we give to folks like Comcast and AT&T the ability to slow down the traffic going to visit our websites. If we manage to protect that access, then we can create the new media that will allow us to talk to each other. You know, I mean, a lot of people don't watch TV that much anymore. So the key is, you know, making sure that no one controls the internet in a way that restricts us from talking to each other.
Here in actually second is fine.
That's a rather huge key, because right now there is considerable discussion from big players in the internet arena for monopolizing it and slowing it down. And it is, I think, fundamental to the communications necessary. People on the street don't know or care about the things you're talking about. They are hunkered down, worried, and not looking around very much. They do not care about history in the sense of Jeffersonianism, because they don't know a thing about it. A quick, you know, and kids, who I've taught for many, many years, aren't against learning about it, but it's got to be a short sentence or two. And so how are you going to get past that without a free internet, which is where you get kids and many of the people of your age and less than mine?
Well, I'm not sure about my age. You know, I mean, one thing I see in my own house, I mean, my kids, they're pretty into net neutrality. I mean, it's like that whole generation is like, they have understand it, they bought into it. There's a whole army out there. There's millions and millions of people who bought into this idea. And these kids, they don't watch TV anymore. You know, so they have, through all of their systems of connecting with each other, they understand what net neutrality is. They understand that it's common carriage. You know, it's so their ability to, you know, their ability to talk to each other, to educate each other, is pretty high. We don't have to actually necessarily go out and get everyone to understand what Jefferson and Madison said. But we, you know, because people just understand this stuff naturally. People use common sense. It's only economists who have these theories. You know, when you're like talking about too big to fail, you know, one of the things about too big to fail, it's actually, I tell people, oh, you know, we put all of this component comes from this country and all of this component comes from this country. And then people say, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. You know, and yeah. And so, but the economists say, oh no, that's, you put all your eggs in one basket because you get this efficiency. So, you know, people just using common sense, we don't have to connect everyone back to the old-timey ways. We just got to get people to trust their own common sense and trust their own instincts and connect people to the idea that someone out there, it ain't the market that's taking away your property, it's not the market that's taking away your business, it's somebody on Wall Street using a corporation to come and take away your business, and take away your community, and take away all the opportunities of your children.
Decades have gone to the top 10% of most, to the top 10%, to the top 1%. What's the relationship, between, if any, between the change, the 81 change, and how we enforce antitrust and the increasing inequality in there?
I mean, I think it's a huge, I mean, that is probably the key point, because what happened is there were a couple of other issues, but it was how do we, fundamentally it's how do we use, who gets to use the corporations and how do they get to use the corporations. Antitrust and monopoly law was a major part of it. But also corporate governance. Back in 1981, we had a totally different understanding of how we govern our corporations, especially our major industrial corporations. Because these are, since they are governments, what you do is you create constitutions that determine who gets to control them. All of these governments have constitutions, and there's constitutions. In the old days, they used to say, well, you got a whole bunch of folks that have a say in how this government is used. You got management, and you got also professional management back then. but you also had, some of the folks on the side, the investors, but also labor had a say, the government had a say, the community had a say. So back during the era of stakeholder capitalism, corporations were used radically differently. Nowadays, one of the things, this parallel revolutions we didn't talk about, which is how do you use the corporation? Now we all say, oh, the corporation is a private property that's supposed to serve the interests of the shareholders. That's a pretty radically different view of the use of the corporation. So that's, that's this other parallel revolution that took place, and that says, okay, these corporations, rather than maintaining and developing these industrial arts and carrying them over time and making better products for us and making better technologies for us, which is the way it used to be, we're just going to use them to empower a few folks by giving them money. Even if it means taking this technology and destroying it or selling it. Even if it means taking this machine that we rely on and destroying it or selling it. So, what happened is we allowed these corporations to become taxation devices. We allow them to become wealth transfer devices that take wealth out of people's pensions, take wealth out of people's wages, and transfers them to folks on Wall Street. So that happened pretty much parallel with this revolution in competition policy. So absolutely, 1981, it was a change of regime. It was a coup. A very quiet, very real coup took place in this country in 1981. And I'll tell you something, it's like, the regime changed and all the people play in the regime. Clinton plays within the regime put in place by Reagan. Obama is playing within the regime put in place by Reagan. So what we're looking at now is regime change, countering that coup.
We're going to do two very quick final questions. We can just quick questions and
What are your thoughts on the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United?
Can't we sit down and talk about something positive?
Sorry.
Well, I mean, one of the positive things is that people are less and less watching TV. So you're, people communicating without seeing the advertisement. So that, in this case, is a good thing. And it's also, what you're seeing is actually two parties are diverging a lot on how much TV they watch. So it is a problem. My sense is because of the shift online, it's less of a problem. There's also still a pretty wide diversity on many issues within the corporate community. So you can often find other people to fight.
final question.
Given the structure that was put in place in 81, and given the difficulties of doing this from the top down, I see some real hopeful signs in terms of bottom up from increasing worker ownership and management in quite a wide variety of companies such as Southwest Airlines, which it seems to me is a growing trend, and I really appreciate your thoughts on how successful that can be in terms of challenging and breaking up this kind of monopoly control.
No, I mean, there are a number of examples of corporations in which the constitutional structure, who's running it and what it's run for, is still like the Southwest. It's pretty different. There's actually in the UK, there's a pretty major new cooperative movement that is, sort of taking shape, and with these new technologies, our ability to create cooperatives. And my wife is actually doing, all these solar co-ops out of Washington, and her ability to make these things and scale them up is pretty amazing. I'd say as far as bottom up, I mean, this whole food movement is another case in which it's bottom up, and it's like, it's not all Alice Waters. Where I live in a middle-class neighborhood in Washington, and we have a food place, and all of these Salvadoran families, they come in with their food stamps, and they buy, because it's like so much better than what they can get at the store, and often it's cheaper. Not always, So, but it's this case in which you've got buyers and producers actually interacting outside of the corporate system. And there's a huge number of challenges to scaling that up. In fact, we're not going to be able to scale that up unless we start taking on the Walmarts, unless we start taking on the Smithfields, unless we start taking on the Tysons. Because they will squash anything that gets even a little bit big. But there's that energy, and that's the energy that's out there that we're going to be able to ride.
Barry, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. I feel like I may have been personally educated out of common sense a long time ago, but in Tom Paine-like fashion, Barry Lynn is making, I think all of us at least think and consider different things in different ways. So I hope many of you will come up and buy the book here, talk to Barry, have him sign the book, and thanks so much again for coming out and spending your lunchtime with us. Really appreciate it.